Sometimes it feels like my life is a showcase of the perfect family, hiding behind a cracked, dusty mask. Have you ever seen the fragile sparkle of glass shatter under the weight of truth? I grew up in a world where luxury was the norm, but behind all those crystal chandeliers and gilded frames, there was another world, a world of manipulation, debt, and ruthless demands. My name is Samantha, and I grew up in a family that seemed perfect from the outside. We lived in a huge house in an affluent part of town, where every morning began with the gleam of sunlight reflecting off the marble steps by the pool. We had a three-car garage, which my father built himself in our lavish home, proudly telling everyone he did it for us. His company, which started as a dream and a few $1,000s, turned into a successful enterprise that gave us everything we could possibly wish for. My mother, Diana, was the perfect complement to this picture of prosperity. Her morning outings to the country club turned into fashion parades, where she never missed an opportunity to show off her latest acquisitions. "Darling, I simply must have that new Gucci bag," she would say with a certain feigned ease, twirling a strand of her perfectly coiffed hair. Father would just smile, pulling out his credit card. It was their ritual. She would ask, he would pay, and life went on. Mother was a master in the art of consumption. Each month brought new dresses, shoes, jewelry, and, of course, trips to exotic resorts. There, she would pose against the backdrop of pristine beaches for endless photos, which she immediately posted on social media with captions like, "The perfect life." Meanwhile, I stayed home with yet another nanny. Our nannies rotated as frequently as my mother's accessory collections. No one could stay long, either mother was unhappy with their manners, or she found some excuse about their supposed disrespect. But one day, Miss Sarah came into our lives. She was different from the rest. She read me bedtime stories, helped me with homework, taught me how to bake cookies, and even sat on the floor playing board games with me. For the first time, I felt that someone genuinely cared about me. But even she didn't last. "She used your silk scarf, Samantha," Mother explained, though I knew it was a lie. Miss Sarah was far too proper for something like that. But Mother couldn't tolerate anyone whose presence even slightly threatened her control. My childhood was always missing one crucial thing: stability. But everything truly fell apart when I was 14. Father began working late, saying he was trying to close an important deal. He looked exhausted, but no one noticed except me. Mother was too absorbed in planning a trip to the Maldives, flipping through catalogs and discussing the perfect poses for photos. Then, one night, the phone rang. That sound still haunts me in the silence. Mother's scream echoed through the house. Father had collapsed in his office. A heart attack, the doctor said. The paramedics couldn't save him. At that moment, the world that seemed so solid, like a glass dome over our family, began to crack. The funeral passed in a gray haze, black dresses, the marble coldness of people who came more out of courtesy than genuine grief. I stood beside Mother, who played the role of the grieving widow flawlessly. But I saw the panic in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of losing her husband, it was the fear of losing her lifestyle. It didn't take long before Mother entered Father's office and sat in his chair. I watched from the doorway as she spun around a couple of times, as if testing how this new role suited her. She adjusted the lapels of her expensive blazer and, pretending everything was under control, began calling meetings. "I learned everything about this business from my husband," she declared to people who had been with the company for years. I saw their skepticism. I knew myself that Mother had never been interested in Father's work. The most she ever contributed to the company was hosting holiday parties. That evening at dinner, she talked endlessly. About her ambitious plans, about how the company would now thrive under her leadership. With every word she spoke, I felt the wall between us grow taller. "Did you know, Samantha, that your father had all these complicated spreadsheets?" Mother asked, idly twirling a golden pen she had found in his desk drawer. "Well, I've simplified everything. Who needs endless numbers when you've got instinct? She smiled, but there was no warmth in her smile, only a confidence that bordered on madness. Mom, maybe you should hire someone to help you with managing everything? I suggested timidly, sensing the tension in the room grow heavier. Don't be silly, darling, she waved me off as if I'd suggested something absurd. I've got it all under control. You should hear how impressed everyone is with my natural business acumen. But I knew no one was impressed. From the moment Mother took over the company, I watched as the seasoned employees began to disappear, one by one. First, Father's trusted CFO left, then the operations manager, and after them, the junior staff. Every day, I overheard whispered conversations about missed payments, canceled contracts, and mounting debts. Mother seemed oblivious. She started using corporate funds for her personal expenses, insisting she deserved it as CEO. When I cautiously asked why she was doing this, she only patted me on the head and said, "You're too young to understand business, darling." Family gatherings turned into performances where my mother boasted about her imaginary successes. "The company has never been in better shape," she declared with feigned pride, ignoring the obvious. "James would be so proud." I sat in the corner, silently clenching my teeth. My father would have been horrified to see what his dream had become. I was only 15, but even I could see we were hurtling toward disaster. The final blow came just days before my 16th birthday. A bankruptcy notice arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, right as my mother had ordered new office furniture. Everything collapsed. The company was sold to cover debts, but it wasn't enough. Then it was the house's turn. I still remember the movers carrying out the furniture, the heavy carved mirrors, and my mother's countless designer dresses. She stood off to the side, pretending to be indifferent, but her eyes burned with hatred for the world. We moved into a tiny house on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place my mother used to pass by with disdain. Now, it was our reality. The only thing left was the money my father had set aside for my college education in a protected fund my mother couldn't access, no matter how hard she tried. "Samantha, darling," she said one day in that sweet tone of voice I could no longer stand, "you know, we could really use that money right now. College can always wait." "No, Mom," I replied firmly. "That money is for my education." Her face darkened instantly. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? You're just going to watch your mother suffer while you have money that could help us?" From that moment on, she barely spoke to me, except when the topic of money came up. Her silence was cold and threatening. But I stood my ground. I had seen how quickly she could destroy everything she touched, and I wasn't going to let her ruin my future. The next 2 years passed in a drawn-out, tense silence. Our conversations were reduced to short arguments, where I was always made to feel at fault. My mother complained about how unfair the world was to her, how everyone had turned their back on her, and blamed me for her misery. She was no longer the glamorous woman who sparkled at social events. Her life had become a pitiful existence, filled with bitterness. When my graduation day arrived, I knew my mother wasn't going to celebrate my achievements. That morning, she sat at the kitchen table, lazily stirring her coffee. "Why should I throw you a graduation party?" she asked with biting calm. "You don't even help your mother when she needs it." Her words were icy, like a slap in the face. But I stayed silent. I had grown used to these attacks and had learned not to react because I knew that if I let her, she would crush me. By then, I had been accepted into Barrett University, a good school 3 states away. My mother didn't know yet, but I had chosen it specifically because of how far away it was. To me, that distance meant freedom. As soon as the graduation ceremony ended, I decided it was time to tell her my plans. "You're abandoning me," she gasped, clutching her chest in a theatrical gesture. "After everything I've done for you?" "I'm not abandoning you, Mom," I replied calmly. "I'll call." She looked as if I had just announced my intention to move to another planet. Her wounded expression and sarcastic comments followed me all summer as I prepared to leave. But when I finally moved into my tiny dorm room at Barrett University, it felt like paradise. No more guilt trips, no more manipulation, no more walking on eggshells. It was my chance to start over. I learned how to stretch the money my father had left for my education. Cheap food, used textbooks, no spring break trips. Every dollar counted. The only consistent expense was the mandatory phone calls home. "Hi, Mom, how are you?" I began every conversation. "Oh, I'm barely surviving," she usually responded with a heavy sigh. "Unlike some people, I don't have a trust fund to fall back on." She never once called me first in all 4 years, but I didn't care. I was too busy building a life of my own. I graduated with honors, earning a degree that became a symbol of my independence, and landed a job at Thompson & Associates. There, I found not only a stable income but also a true passion. Work became my focus, and I poured everything I had into it. 2 years later, I had achieved significant success. I had been promoted twice and finally felt like my life was beginning to take the shape I had always dreamed of. But one evening, during the Christmas holidays, the phone rang. "The heating is broken again," my mother complained. "I can barely afford groceries, let alone repairs. But don't worry about me, I'll just wear 3 sweaters and eat crackers." Something inside me shifted in that moment. Maybe it was my recent promotion, or maybe I was just tired of feeling guilty. Without thinking, I said, "I'll come next week." The house looked worse than I remembered. Peeling paint, broken gutters, and old, stained carpet. My mother opened the door with the same martyr-like expression I knew so well. "I'm fine," she assured me, though her voice trembled. Over coffee, I told her about my plan. "I want to help. I can give you $1,000 a month, and we'll get the house back in order." Her eyes lit up. For the first time in years, I saw genuine joy in them. Within weeks, the house was freshly painted, the carpets replaced, and the heating was working again. It felt like the beginning of something new. My mother gradually began to change. She started calling me with invitations to dinner. "Samantha, sweetheart, I was thinking we could try that new Italian restaurant on Mason Street. Nothing fancy, just a nice family dinner. I've invited Aunt Carol and Uncle Pete." These dinners became our tradition. Mom chose modest restaurants with checkered tablecloths and short wine menus. Sometimes it was just the two of us, other times, we were joined by her sister Carol, her old friend Martha, or Uncle Pete. The bills rarely exceeded $200, and I paid without hesitation. I still remember the first time my mom bragged about me at one of those dinners. We were at Luigi's, a cozy family-owned restaurant. "I told you," she announced to Aunt Carol, beaming with pride. "Samantha just landed the Anderson account, the biggest client in her firm's history. My daughter is a real force in business. Just like her father." It felt good. For the first time in my life, her pride in me seemed genuine. She no longer saw me as an accessory meant to bolster her status. Now, I was something more to her. This time, Mom was sincere. I could tell she was truly proud of what I had accomplished on my own. Our dinners became more frequent, and now it was her calling me every few weeks to suggest new places she'd heard about. Never anything extravagant, no fine dining, just warm, welcoming spots with simple, delicious food. Mom invited different combinations of relatives and friends, Aunt Carol, Uncle Pete, sometimes her old friend Martha. They were all genuinely grateful for these gatherings, and no one tried to outshine the others. It was quiet, peaceful company that I had learned to appreciate. Meanwhile, my career was thriving. I closed larger and larger deals, earned substantial bonuses, and eventually saved enough money for a down payment on my first home. It was a big step for me. The mortgage was significant but manageable with my salary. When Mom came to the housewarming, she didn't make any remarks about the size or location of the apartment for the first time in years. Instead, she just hugged me, smiled, and said, "You've done well, sweetheart." When I upgraded to a new car, it felt like a natural decision to give Mom my old one. It was a 5-year-old Lexus that I had meticulously maintained, and it was in excellent condition. Her Honda had long since fallen into disrepair, and I knew she needed a reliable vehicle. Mom was grateful but didn't turn it into yet another dramatic gesture. But the car was only the beginning. During one of my visits, I noticed her outdated dial-up internet connection. Without a second thought, I arranged for high-speed fiber optic internet to be installed. Later, I found out that she was keeping the house uncomfortably cold in the winter to save on heating bills, so I started covering her utility costs. These were small steps, but I could see how they improved her life. The real turning point came when I was planning my first business trip to New York. Mom had always dreamed of seeing Broadway, so I suggested she come along. When Aunt Carol heard about it, she excitedly confessed that she had never been to New York. In the end, I booked tickets for the 3 of us. They turned out to be perfect travel companions, enthusiastic yet easygoing. We stayed in comfortable but affordable hotels, ate at authentic diners, and most of the time, they entertained themselves, exploring the city and soaking in its atmosphere. That trip marked the beginning of a new tradition. Whenever my business travels took me to Boston, Chicago, or San Francisco, I would bring Mom and 1 or 2 relatives along. While I attended meetings, they explored the city, and in the evenings, we would gather for dinner or go on tours together. They never asked for anything extravagant, but I would occasionally surprise them with tickets to a musical, a dinner cruise, or something else that created lasting memories. These moments were special. For the first time, I saw in my mother the woman she could have been if money hadn't distorted her worldview so deeply all those years ago. She became calmer, more grateful, and genuine. It felt like we were rebuilding a connection that had been lost. One morning, as I was reviewing contracts in my office, the phone rang. There was an unusual excitement in Mom's voice. "Samantha, sweetheart, I've been thinking about my birthday next month. You know I'm turning 55. "Of course, Mom," I said, setting the papers aside. "I was planning to come. Did you want to do something special?" "Oh, yes," she said with a note of joy. "This time, I want to celebrate properly. It's a big milestone, after all." I smiled, happy to hear her enthusiasm. "How about a cozy dinner at your house? We can gather all the close family, cook your favorite dishes." "That sounds wonderful, darling," she said with a warmth that I had been hearing in her voice more and more often. I was already mentally making a list of dishes and guests, knowing that this celebration would be more than just a birthday. It would be another step toward restoring our understanding of each other. We could have invited the usual group, Aunt Carol, Uncle Pete, and Martha. I even suggested hiring a catering company or ordering food from that Italian restaurant Mom loved so much. But she abruptly cut me off. "Oh no, darling," she said with an unusual calmness. "Don't worry about any of that. I want to handle everything myself. You've done so much for me lately. Let me celebrate my birthday on my own terms." Something in her tone should have raised a red flag, but instead, I felt a strange sense of relief. I was just happy to see her taking the initiative. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I really don't mind helping." "I'm absolutely sure," she assured me, her voice so light it felt almost insincere. "Just be there by 7. I'll text you the address of the restaurant the day before." When her birthday arrived, I flew in early and checked into the usual hotel. Her message with the restaurant's address came in the afternoon, but I didn't pay much attention to the name until I saw it through the taxi window. El Chateau. The most expensive restaurant in town, with crystal chandeliers, gilded walls, and a menu so exclusive it didn't bother listing prices to avoid intimidating the clientele. It was the kind of place people spoke about in hushed tones, whispering about astronomical bills and months-long waits for reservations. The maitre d' escorted me through the grand dining room filled with elegant guests, past the glittering chandeliers, to a private section in the back of the restaurant. My heart stopped. A massive private dining room filled with no fewer than 30 people. Pristine white tablecloths, silver cutlery, and dozens of our relatives alongside half of Mom's social circle. I didn't know what to say. Mom rushed toward me, her eyes gleaming, and enveloped me in a tight hug. Her signature perfume, one that had always been her calling card, filled the air around us. "I'm so glad you're here, darling," she said, brushing away an imaginary tear. I let her guide me to my seat, too stunned to protest just yet. Aunt Carol leaned across the table toward me, her face glowing. "You're such a wonderful daughter," she said with admiration. "Your mother hasn't stopped talking about how you insisted on throwing her this amazing party." My lips moved soundlessly, but no words came out. Meanwhile, the waitstaff began serving the dishes: foie gras, Japanese wagyu beef, Maine lobster, imported caviar. Wine flowed freely, with bottles that were clearly far from budget-friendly. I watched as everyone around me indulged in a meal that I knew was obscenely expensive. A quick mental calculation brought me to a terrifying figure: at least $8,000, possibly more. Aunt Carol stood up, holding a champagne glass, and gently tapped it with a silver spoon. The chime of crystal filled the room, silencing all conversations. "I'd like to make a toast," she announced, her face radiant. "To my incredible niece Samantha. Your generosity tonight is a testament to what an amazing daughter you are. The way you take care of your mother. And now, this extraordinary celebration." "Excuse me," I interrupted, feeling a tremor in my voice that threatened to swell into an uncontrollable wave. "I need to stop you right there." The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned to me. Mom's smile froze on her face, her eyes now shining with something other than joy. "I didn't organize this dinner," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. I continued scanning the room, which practically screamed opulence. "I didn't choose this restaurant. I didn't approve any of these expenses. In fact, this is the first I'm hearing about it." A ripple of confused murmurs spread across the room. Someone dropped a fork, the clatter echoing against the marble floor. Mom, seated across from me, pressed her lips together, her face reddening. "Samantha, don't be ridiculous," she hissed, leaning closer to me. "Of course, you organized this. Who else would have paid for something like this?" I slowly rose to my feet, my chair scraping against the floor, breaking the tense silence. "No, Mom," I said, doing my best to keep calm. "It wasn't me. I suggested a cozy dinner at your house or ordering food from your favorite Italian restaurant. You said you wanted to handle everything yourself. You never mentioned El Chateau or inviting 30 people. But you always pay," she muttered, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Yes, for reasonable things," I replied, gesturing toward the extravagant dishes being served by the waitstaff. "For regular restaurants. For simple bills. But not for this. I am not obligated to give you a blank check." Her face twisted with rage. "Ungrateful," she shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. "After everything I've done for you." I let out a dry laugh, devoid of any joy. "You mean like trying to spend my college fund? Or destroying Dad's company?" The room fell into a deafening silence. Every gaze was fixed on me. I reached into my purse, pulled out my wallet, and counted out a few bills. "This covers the pork chop and the glass of wine," I said, placing the money on the pristine white tablecloth. "Good luck with the rest." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked toward the exit. My heels clicked against the marble floor, like the ticking of a clock counting down the end of this farce. No one called after me. No one even tried to stop me. As I stepped outside, the night air hit my face like a slap. I flagged down the first taxi I saw and told the driver to take me back to the hotel. The moment I got to my room, I turned off my phone. I knew the calls would start immediately: angry messages from my mother, disappointed questions from relatives, demands for explanations. But I didn't want to hear any of it. I wanted silence. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling, while the city lights flickered outside the window. For the first time in years, I felt truly alone, and strangely, wonderfully free. The next morning, when I turned my phone back on, it nearly exploded with notifications. 47 missed calls from my mother. 28 from Aunt Carol. 15 from Uncle Pete. Dozens more from other relatives. My voicemail was full. I took a deep breath and dialed my mother's number. She picked up after the first ring. "Mom, I'm sorry things went the way they did last night," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm coming over now. We need to talk about what happened at the restaurant." I sincerely hoped she'd meet me halfway. That maybe, just maybe, she'd realize how wrong it was to throw such an extravagant party with someone else's money, without even asking. But I was wrong. "How dare you?" she screamed, and I had to pull the phone away from my ear. Her voice was loud and piercing. "How could you humiliate me like that in front of everyone? You made me a laughingstock." "Mom, you did that to yourself," I replied, feeling the exhaustion rising within me. "I can't keep pulling you out of holes you keep digging." "After everything I've done for you," she began again, but I cut her off. "Don't you understand that money isn't everything, Mom? We can't keep living like we still have a fortune. It's not right." There was a long sigh on the other end, followed by a cold, clipped response. "Fine. Do whatever you want." She hung up, leaving me sitting in complete silence. "You selfish, self-absorbed, ungrateful child," her voice rang out like hammer strikes on an anvil. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know what I had to endure after your little tantrum? You humiliated me in front of everyone." I held the phone to my ear, refusing to put it down, unwilling to miss a single word, though everything inside me felt like it was tightening into a painful knot. "Do you know what happened after you stormed out like a spoiled brat?" she continued. "Everyone had to chip in $400 each to cover the bill. $400. The total was $12,000, Samantha. 12,000. And you, with all your money, couldn't even bother to pay for your own mother's birthday dinner. You're selfish, do you hear me? Selfish." My head spun. $12,000. Had they ordered even more after I left? The food, the wine, an extravagant spectacle at my expense, without my consent. And after all that, she had the audacity to call me selfish? "You think I'm selfish, Mom?" My voice shook with anger. "Fine. Let me show you what selfish really looks like." I hung up in the middle of her tirade. This time, my hands didn't tremble. Instead, a cold calmness settled over me. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. A few clicks later, the automatic monthly transfer of $1,000 to her account was canceled. Then, I made another call. "This is Samantha Mitchell," I said to the manager at the dealership where I had purchased my old Lexus. "I need to arrange for the car to be towed. It's still registered in my name." Within 20 minutes, a tow truck was on its way to my mother's house. Next, I opened the website for her internet provider. 3 more clicks, and her high-speed connection was scheduled for disconnection. Finally, I logged into my social media account. My message was brief and to the point. Effective immediately, I will no longer be financing any trips or travel expenses for my mother or relatives. Any prior arrangements are cancelled. Please plan your travels accordingly. I hit post and closed the laptop. It felt like the end of an entire chapter of my life. The consequences were immediate. My notifications exploded with comments from relatives who, just days ago, had been happily enjoying my generosity. "How could you do this to your own mother?" Aunt Carol wrote. "After everything she sacrificed for you? You're a selfish, money-obsessed woman," added my cousin Rachel, whom I had helped move into her new apartment just a year ago. "Don't bother coming to my wedding in September. I don't want someone so heartless at my special day." "Your father would be ashamed of who you've become," chimed in Uncle Pete, who had been happily enjoying my hospitality in San Francisco just 2 months earlier. "Is this how he raised you? To abandon your family?" The comments kept coming, each one more venomous than the last. Aunt Carol delivered another blow. "You can forget about my 60th birthday party next month. We don't need your money or your gifts." I watched the flood of accusations with a grim calm. It was astounding how quickly they had forgotten all the dinners, the trips, and the times I paid the bill without a second thought. Now, I was the villain in their narrative, a greedy daughter who had cut off her poor mother. Not one of them mentioned the $12,000 dinner bill they had shared. No one questioned why my mother had invited 30 people to a restaurant where the base cost per head was $300 without consulting me. In their version of events, those details didn't matter. I sat in my quiet apartment, reading their angry messages, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could finally breathe. This wasn't a loss. It was liberation. The weeks following the restaurant incident were some of the hardest of my life. I buried myself in work, taking on any extra projects that could fill the void and distract me from my thoughts. Every evening, I stayed at the office late, sifting through reports and closing new deals, and on weekends, I surrounded myself with stacks of documents at home. My phone seemed to have a life of its own, constantly buzzing with messages and calls. Relatives tried reaching me from unknown numbers when I blocked theirs. Sometimes I changed my number just to shake them off, but they always found a way back. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering, did I do the right thing? Was I too harsh in cutting everyone off? But each time I remembered my mother's endless manipulations, her ceaseless attempts to guilt-trip me, I reassured myself that I had made the right choice. The birthday dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the most glaring example of how she had always treated me. 2 months after that night, my mother tried to reach out again. She left a voicemail on my roommate's phone. "Samantha, darling, can we talk? I miss you. Everything's been so hard. Maybe we could meet for coffee? Just the two of us." Her voice sounded unusually soft, almost vulnerable. Part of me, the part that still clung to the idea of family, wanted to believe she had changed. That maybe, finally, she understood. But I couldn't help but notice that her words lacked any trace of an apology. There was no acknowledgement of her actions, no accountability for what she had done. It was just another attempt to reel me back in, like retrieving a misplaced possession. I blocked that number, too. Life moved on. I received another promotion at work. Without the constant burden of supporting my mother and my extended family, my salary seemed to stretch endlessly. For the first time, I could plan my life without factoring in the needs of others. I took a solo trip to Europe. This time, no one asked me to adjust the itinerary to include their favorite cities or to pay for luxury hotel rooms. It was a strange but wonderful feeling to travel exactly the way I wanted. Occasionally, through mutual acquaintances or social media, I would hear bits and pieces about my mother. She had to downsize again, moving into even smaller accommodations. She complained to anyone who would listen about her ungrateful daughter, who had abandoned her in her time of need. Relatives, of course, sympathized with her, but I noticed one interesting thing. None of them offered her the financial support I had provided for years. They expressed their condolences and nodded, but no one rushed to open their wallets. Sometimes, I missed my mother. But it wasn't the woman I knew that I longed for, it was the version of her that she could have been. I missed the idea of family, but not the reality of what it had been. My family had become a web of people who were all too happy to take whatever I could offer but were quick to condemn me the moment I said enough. I sometimes wondered if the day would ever come when my mother truly understood. Maybe she would one day realize that love shouldn't be tied to money. That family isn't about transactions but about something deeper, built on mutual understanding and respect. If that day ever came, I might be open to rebuilding some sort of relationship. But only with clear boundaries and a commitment to mutual respect. Even then, I would never go back to being the family ATM. That chapter of my life was closed for good. Now, I was building my life on my own terms, and it was the best decision I had ever made.